Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to the most comprehensive Hindu analysis on YouTube. So let's start today's discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 9 important articles. So let's cover them comprehensively so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. So, today, the first topic, of course, is on the biggest development, the US Israel attack on Iran and Iran's retaliation. So, yesterday, the much anticipated war has started, something which could shake West Asia, which could have a lasting impact on the region and could significantly have an impact on India's interests. So, yesterday, Israel and US, in coordination, have launched massive strikes on Iran's military facilities, government establishment, including the top leadership itself. Israel has codenamed this operation as Operation Roaring Lion, which is a clear reference to the symbolic message which is attached with the lion symbol in Iranian culture that refers to the Shah's regime and a possible push by Israel and US to try and bring back monarchy by trying to bring Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah, and try and rebuild maybe a new structure after toppling the existing regime. On the United States side, they have labeled the operation as Operation Epic Fury. So, in this combined operation, US and Israel have carried out major airstrikes, naval strikes, and they have taken direct aim at the top leadership of the Iranian regime itself. So, just in the early morning, we have received official confirmation from all the sides, from Israel, US, and most importantly from Iran, that the supreme leader, Ayatollah al Khomeini, has been killed in this operation. In fact, when the initial strikes began yesterday, the first barrage of missiles landed at few important installations where the top leadership was present. So, along with the Ayatollah, many other top senior commanders and generals have also been wiped out. Even Iran's defense minister, the commander of the IRGC, and the commander in chief of the Iranian army, and several national security officials have been wiped out in these strikes. So, this change is widely welcomed by the people of Iran. The Iranian people who have been oppressed and crushed by the theocratic, autocratic regime under the radical Shia clerics finally get some breather. But of course, it means that right now we might witness a prolonged struggle, not just between US, Israel, and Iran, but as well as inside Iran to try and stabilize the country. But does it mean that the regime is going to fall overnight? See, just the elimination of Ayatollah and the top leadership doesn't mean anything because this would simply mean the decapitation of the current leadership. In fact, when the Ayatollah was still alive, several months ago, a clear succession line had already been established along with a proper chain of command. It is believed that Iran had always planned for such a contingency. What will happen in the eventuality of such a massive war, where US Israel would definitely take aim at the leadership itself? So, especially after last year's 12-day war, where US and Israel had bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, it was reported that the Iranian leadership had created a proper chain of succession, where the Ayatollah had chosen three of his preferred loyalists to take over in case of the decapitation of the leadership. And there are also reports that within the IRGC and the Iranian armed forces, the command and control structure has been highly decentralized and powers have been delegated to the lowest levels possible. That is, even if the top and mid level leaderships are wiped out, even then, local commanders they have been provided the decision making powers to continue the conflict and ensure that the regime survives at any cost. So, this war right now is about a do or die situation for the Iranian regime. It's about a war for survival. So, the Iranian regime has nothing to lose. And that's why you are seeing a complete retaliation from Iran across West Asia. Iran has launched drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles at all American military bases that are located in the neighboring countries in the Gulf region, from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. where even civilian targets have been hit. Then important American bases in Qatar, the very headquarters of the Central Command and the 5th Naval Fleet in Bahrain, and the major US base in Kuwait and in Jordan. All these targets have been essentially hit by Iranian strikes. So, this conflict is not likely to end anytime soon. This is most likely to be a slightly prolonged conflict, lasting probably several days, maybe even several weeks. So, one thing becomes very clear that US and Israel have gone into this war with a very clear intent. They have a clear end game in mind, which is to engineer a regime change. They've already achieved one difficult part of the objective, which is to eliminate the Ayatollah and his top leadership and advisors. But now, the next step would be, what would be the future course of this conflict? Would there be a decisive victory for US, Israel, and the allies? Would other West Asian powers directly enter the conflict? Or would the Iranian regime somehow manage to survive? And how about the Iranian people? Would they rebel? Would they use this once in a lifetime opportunity to try and take power back from these radical Shia clerics and restore the normalcy back in Iran, which was seen many, many decades ago? So there are some difficult questions, complex issues that you need to discuss and understand. So today we have plenty of articles in the newspaper, and let's use the help of these articles and dive deep into this topic. See, when you look at Iran, the issue here is not as simple. I mean, you can't just brand US, Israel as the saviors of the Iranian people, right? Though Iranian people are celebrating the killing of the Ayatollah, which of course is understandable given the kind of oppression and persecution that had occurred under the Ayatollah's regime. This is, as I said, unlikely to end anytime soon, as the regime is likely to survive or try to evolve and adapt. But when you look at the history in the past, US and Israel are equally guilty and accountable for whatever has happened in the region. There are no saints in this conflict. If you go back to 1950s, in 1951-52, Iran had elected a democratic leader under Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist leader who nationalized Iranian oil resources and natural resources, which was, of course, not liked by the West. Britain, US turned against Iran, and they essentially carried out a regime change, toppling Mossadegh, and they installed the Iranian monarchy. They brought back Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, and turned Iran into a monarchy. So, though culturally, socially, Iran became slightly progressive, more liberal, adopted Western culture and values, the problem was it essentially turned into a puppet regime, a regime that was controlled, manipulated by the US and the West to suit their interests, which almost appeared like colonial imperial interests. So this essentially led to the buildup of resentment in Iran throughout 1960s and 70s. Eventually, in 1979, when the people rose up against the Shah's regime, triggering the Iranian Revolution, this revolution was very quickly hijacked by the radical Shia clerics. So in 1979, Iran came under a radical theocracy, which turned the country into an authoritarian state with strict enforcement of the Sharia. And since then, the people of Iran over the last 47 years have been trapped under this oppressive regime under the supreme leadership of the Ayatollah. So the Ayatollahs can be replaced, right? But the ideological structure, the theological foundation which makes up the Iranian regime, it remains still intact. And unless and until there is a complete toppling of the regime itself, a complete outright defeat of the Iranian forces, it won't mean much for the Iranian people themselves. So this brings us to the question as to what leads to this rivalry between Iran and Israel. Why are they such arch rivals? See, this was not always the case. Before 1979, believe it or not, Iran and Israel were very, very close allies. Since Iran was under the Shah, which was aligned with US, aligned with the West, the Shah had very good ties with the Israeli leadership. Even over the question of Palestine, from 1948 till 1979, it was primarily the Arab Sunni states which were fighting against Israel and backing the Palestinian movement, supporting the right of Palestinians for their own state, and even extending support for Palestinian extremism and radicalism. So Iran throughout this period until 1979 remained on the side of Israel. They even had a very close defense relationship. Iran had even signed a deal with Israel in 1977 to procure advanced missiles from Israel and even focus on joint defense production. But everything changed in 1979 as a result of the Iranian Revolution. So once Iran turned into a radical Shia theocracy, Iran declared death to America and death to Israel. America and Israel were seen as the extension of Satan, as far as the perspective of the Iranian regime was concerned. So since then, Iran started building up its position on the Palestine issue. One of the core objectives of the Iranian regime was to project itself as a leader of the Muslim world by using the Palestinian issue to its own advantage, and it seemed like a practical approach for them. And as a result, they started creating several proxies in the region in order to destabilize Israel and target Israeli and American interests. In 1979 itself, Iran had even enabled some of the radical revolutionaries to carry out a hostage crisis at the US embassy, where American diplomats were held hostage. So since then, US Iran became arch rivals. US brought sanctions on Iran, and Iran was eventually pushed towards the corner where Israel and US would constantly target Iran, and Iran would keep retaliating each and every time. So throughout 1980s and 1990s, we saw this cycle of violence and covert proxy wars continuing and escalating in the region. So Iran built its own axis to counter the nexus of Israel and US. Iran started cultivating a Shia axis, primarily by relying on Syria, which was ruled by the Assad family. The Assad family, which established a dictatorial regime in Syria since 1970s, they belong to the Alawite sect, which is part of Shia Islam. Though Syria primarily has Sunni Muslims, the regime here was a Shia regime, and the Assad family was completely aligned with Iran. And these were the two closest allies in the region. So, across Iraq and even Lebanon, Iran successfully built a Shia axis which could counter Israel and counter even the Sunni powers. For Sunni powers like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the others, for them the equation had started changing from 1979. Because by 1980, Egypt, which was in a constant state of war with Israel, it finally signed a peace deal, recognized Israel, in order to get back the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel had captured in the 1967 war. Through the Camp David Accords mediated by the US, Egypt established peace with Israel, became the first Arab state in the region to recognize Israel. And since then, the entire equation in this region started changing. Also, because of the Gulf oil crisis of the 70s, we saw a closer alignment between US and Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni powers. And once Iran rose as a Shia regime in 1979 and the Shia Sunni rivalry started playing out, the Sunni powers aligned with United States and even built a secret alliance with Israel, creating their own axis to counter the Shia axis led by Iran and Syria. So this is where Iran cultivated these proxy outfits, extremist groups, starting with Hezbollah, a formidable Shia militia primarily based out of Lebanon. Then in Iraq as well, even when Saddam Hussein was in power, Iran and Iraq anyways had fought a conflict when Saddam Hussein was there in the 1980s. So Iraq had a significant Shia population, and even here, several Shia militias were cultivated by Iran, such as the Kataib Hezbollah, which is a Iraqi faction of the Hezbollah. So by using the territory of Syria and Iraq, Iran was providing all the support for groups like Hezbollah, arms, funds, training, everything. The IRGC, the paramilitary force and intelligence agency, emerged as a very efficient covert organization which could execute these covert operations. It would set up elite units such as the Quds Force to take forward this covert war against Israel and the United States. Then, by 1990s, as Hamas rose to prominence in Gaza, Iran started sponsoring and supporting the Hamas and even Islamic Jihad to back the Palestinian movement and use it as a proxy to target Israel. And more recently, Iran has sponsored the Houthis in Yemen as another part of the axis to counter Saudi Arabia's dominance in the Sunni powers and even use it to target Israel when necessary. So this made Iran a prime target for US and Israel. Israel had been trying for many years to dismantle the Iranian regime. In fact, it is this intense rivalry in the region which had pushed Iran to take the nuclear path. By 1980s 90s, it was believed that Iran was looking to covertly develop a nuclear program because Israel had already built a nuclear arsenal. It was well on its way to build a very formidable nuclear arsenal. Israel is again not a signatory to the Non Proliferation Treaty, just like India and Pakistan. Though Israel has never officially acknowledged that it possesses nuclear weapons, it's a well known open secret that Israel does possess a nuclear arsenal. Given Israel's military might and the backing it got from US, it became existential threat for Iran to pursue nuclear weapons to create a deterrence against Israel and United States. So it is this pursuit of nuclear weapons program that led to further targeting of Iran by US and Israel. Throughout early 2000s, constant disruption was caused to the nuclear program of Iran through economic sanctions, through covert assassinations as well. Covert assassinations of Iranian scientists, Iranian generals. And this kept on building up the tensions as Iran kept on focusing on its nuclear enrichment. So eventually in 2015, when tensions were at its peak between US and Iran and a war seemed imminent, a nuclear deal was worked out, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran Nuclear Deal, with the involvement of the P5+1 countries and European Union. The five permanent members of the UN Security Council, that is Russia, China, UK and France, along with US, and plus one referring to Germany, and then European Union. They mediated this deal, which brought the tensions between US and Iran to a temporary halt. Under the deal, Iran had agreed to halt its nuclear enrichment and hand over all the stockpiles of highly enriched uranium to European countries. In return, European powers like France and Germany would assist Iran in civilian nuclear technology. Iran also committed under the deal to open up its nuclear facilities for inspections by International Atomic Energy Agency so that independent reviews could be carried out. And US promised to lift the sanctions, and the crippling economic sanctions were finally taken out, and this gave a much required breather for Iran. In fact, this deal it held at least for some time from the 2015 period till 2018. The nuclear deal was held in place because all the sides they remained committed to the agreement. Iran had halted the enrichment, handed over the existing stockpiles, and European countries were assisting Iran in the civilian nuclear program, and US had lifted all the sanctions. In fact, during this period, when Islamic State rose as a threat in Iraq and Syria, this was a major challenge for Iran's influence in the region because ISIS, which had captured significant territory, it was breaking the links between Iran and its proxies, such as Hezbollah and the Syrian regime and Hamas and others. This was the logistics route through which Iran was supplying arms and weapons to Hezbollah, Hamas, and the others. So fighting ISIS became a common concern and objective, where surprisingly US and Iran even aligned together for a brief period. There was Russian involvement as well. Russia would even deploy its forces to support Assad's regime, which was facing its own internal challenge, and even to fight and defeat the Islamic State, which was a threat for Iran's influence in the region. So there has been some instances where US Iran have even collaborated sometimes. For example, during the 2003 Iraq war, when US invaded Iraq, US actually relied on some Iranian support as they toppled Saddam Hussein, who shared rivalry with Iran. So despite their own existing differences, there were instances where US and Iran were working together as well, primarily during the Iraq war and even to fight against Islamic State. But however, the civil war in Syria, which was a result of the Arab Spring revolutionary movement that started in 2010-11, this posed the biggest threat to the Assad's regime in Syria. The civil war, which was allegedly sponsored externally by some of the rivals, including Sunni powers, Israel, and the others, who were looking to topple Assad's regime, created long term instability with the possibility of Assad's regime losing full control over Syria. That's when Iran mobilized all its resources, even pushed Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon to Syria to come to the rescue of Assad's regime. Russia even deployed special forces and fighter jets to target the rebels, and they managed to bring back the control under the Assad's regime. Syria's Assad managed to regain territorial control, and some sort of stability was brought back, even though the civil war continued in different parts of the country. So, this in a way had protected Iran's influence. But 2018 was a real turning point. 2018 and 2023, these 2 years, were the real turning points which leads us to the current situation. In 2018, President Trump, under the first presidency, he quit the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action by alleging that Iran was secretly pursuing enrichment and seeking to build nuclear weapons. This was not backed by US intelligence. Though Trump said that US has intelligence to indicate that Iran is violating the deal, secretly US authorities were disagreeing with his assessment, and press reports indicated that Iran remained committed to the deal. Even the other partners of the deal, the P5+1 countries and European Union, they also swore by Iran's commitments. France, Germany, UK, they certified that Iran was still committed to the deal. Even United Nations, which receives reports of International Atomic Energy Agency, certified that Iran is still following the terms of the deal. Despite this, US unilaterally quit the deal, brought back crippling sanctions on Iran, and that's when tensions started escalating. And US in 2019 even started carrying out even more covert killings and assassinations of Iranian leaders and generals. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Quds force, which was responsible for IRGC's covert external operations, was eliminated in a US drone strike. So, as tensions kept on building up, in 2023, the October 7th attack by Hamas changed everything for West Asia. Because see, after Trump had lost the elections in 2020, the Biden presidency had tried bringing some normalcy back. Also, COVID 19 had helped in easing the tensions because countries were more focused on dealing with the pandemic. Biden administration had restarted the talks to revive the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But before the talks could progress, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 created another big distraction where US Russia got completely involved. And thus, the focus on the Iran nuclear talks was lost. And within a year in 2023, the deadly October 7 terror attack by Hamas changed the entire equations in West Asia. So, since then, the developments that have occurred and the resolve of Israel to use this opportunity to wipe out all the threats that existed in the region is what leads us to the current situation. As you know, Israel swore to completely decimate Hamas. That's exactly what they have done. In the last 3 years, Hamas leadership has almost been wiped out. Then Israel went after Hezbollah in Lebanon, eliminating their top and mid level leadership. And in Syria, Assad's regime was toppled in 2024 by the HTS or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was backed by Turkey and reportedly even by Israel. So the loss of Assad's regime in Syria and the weakening and almost wipeout of Hamas, Hezbollah, and even the Houthis in Yemen, this marked the collapse of Iran's axis of resistance. So Iran was at its weakest. So last year, US and Israel carried out massive strikes primarily aimed at nuclear facilities of Iran, which is called the 12-day war. Prior to this, as part of the Gaza war, few minor clashes had already taken place between Iran and Israel in 2024 and as well as in early 2025, especially when Iran targeted the chief of Hamas, who was in Tehran, and assassinated him. Iran had carried out few symbolic strikes. Then, when the leader of Hezbollah was also eliminated by Israel, Iran again had retaliated, but it was largely symbolic. So Iran had shown a lot of restraint because it was clearly on the back foot. All its proxies and allies were being decimated one by one. So Iran had taken a back step. So last year in June 2025, Israel used the opportunity to try and take aim directly at the nuclear program of Iran. So Iran, though it was publicly saying that it's ready to engage in talks, secretly it was still pursuing the enrichment. Since the nuclear deal broke down, especially after 2019 and 2020, it was widely reported that Iran had resumed its nuclear enrichment, and it had even enriched several tons of uranium up to 60% enrichment. That's just one step away from 90% highly enriched uranium, which is your weapons grade uranium. So, if required, Iran probably could have assembled a warhead maybe in few months. And since Iran has delivery systems such as ballistic missiles and the others, probably in a year or two, it would easily develop nuclear capabilities if, let's say, there was no intervention from US or Israel. And a nuclear Iran is not in the interest of anyone. It's not in the interest of Israel, definitely, not in the interest of the Americans, not in the interest of the Sunni powers. It's not in the interest of even Pakistan and India, which are in the same region. Because another nuclear state here could completely alter the balance of power and even trigger a bigger nuclear arms race. So nobody wants a nuclear Iran, that's for sure. But as Iran had accelerated the program, and now Israel had sort of a mandate and a blessing because of the October 7th attack, it used the opportunity to not just wipe out the proxies of Iran, but it took direct aim at Iran repeatedly. So last year's strikes on the nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan, it significantly weakened Iran's capabilities. Though Israel could not do much damage, Israel largely took out the ground level infrastructure and some military sites as well. Most of the underground facilities, which are built deep underground in tunnels and under mountainous structures, they could not be penetrated by Israel's ordnance. That's where US was dragged into the war, and US carried out massive bombing using bunker buster bombs such as the massive ordnance penetrator. This, according to reports, caused significant damage at the Fordo and Natanz enrichment facility, which clearly set back Iran's nuclear program by several years or decades. But what's interesting was the timing of this particular attack of last year, which Israel had codenamed as Operation Rising Lion. That was the first time Israel referred to the lion symbol as a reference to the Iranian monarchy, the Shah's monarchy, right? The timing was very crucial because even the Trump administration, after Trump came back into office last year, had resumed nuclear talks with Iran. And in June, they were about to engage in the next round of talks to arrive at a deal. As I said, Iranian officials were publicly indicating that they're willing to agree to the terms of the US, stop their enrichment in return for lifting of sanctions. So probably if Israel had not attacked last year, maybe US Iran would have struck a deal and things would have gone back to normal. But the Israeli intention was very clear. It was not just to wipe out the nuclear program, but it was to disrupt the talks, prevent a deal from taking place, and ensure that US gets dragged into this longer conflict with Iran. So as Israel attacked, US was forced to support the ally, and it carried out massive bombing, destroying some of the nuclear facilities. But reports also suggested that Iran had already moved some of the enriched uranium and the stockpiles to other locations. Plus, Iran also has capabilities to revive and rebuild the program. The only thing the strikes did was it delayed the project by many years, probably. So, this is something Israel cannot digest. This is something Israel would never accept. Israel's goal was very, very evident since 2023, which was to use this opportunity to not just wipe out Iran's nuclear abilities forever, but also topple this regime which has threatened Israel since 1979. And that's exactly what we are seeing today. So, since last couple of months, the tensions started building up again. First, we saw the massive protest by Iranian people in January 2026, primarily because of the economic sanctions. Iranian economy has been crippled. Plus, Iranian people are frustrated with the oppressive policies of the regime, the strict enforcement of the Sharia, the dress code, the targeting of women, and the violation of basic human rights is something which has already created a lot of resentment against the regime. So when Iran's economy started failing, the currency weakened, devalued, the traders, the business section of Iran, right, they rebelled along with large-scale youth-led protests, student-led protests that broke out. And President Trump issued a warning that US is ready to intervene to back and support the protesters. But there were clear reports that these protests may not have been entirely organic. Some of it was engineered. Of course, the resentment was there, but Israel openly admitted during the protests that Mossad agents are on the ground, active and supporting the protests which were ongoing. Even the United States indicated that the CIA remains very active on the ground during the protests that were going on, meaning the protests were not entirely organic. Yes, the people want a change, they want to topple this autocratic regime, but there has been clear external intervention and involvement and constant interference to destabilize and topple the regime. So US President Trump threatened Iran if it uses force against protesters that US would be forced to intervene, right? But however, this threat did not immediately materialize. Eventually, Iran crushed the protests, as it always has done. And apparently, thousands of protesters, innocent civilians, were brutally slaughtered in the initial weeks of January. Since then, US started a massive military mobilization. Right after the Venezuela operation to capture Nicolas Maduro, US started placing its spotlight on the Persian Gulf, and a huge military mobilization was underway. This was essentially a preparation for the upcoming nuclear talks at Geneva, which was mediated by Oman. Since last year, Oman was acting as a neutral mediator to bring US and Iran together and work out a deal to prevent such a conflict from occurring. So Switzerland was supposed to host the talks, which was mediated by Oman. And over the last couple of weeks, these talks were going on. As the talks progressed, the US was creating a deterrent and it was moving all the key pieces into position with one of the biggest military mobilizations that has been seen in this region. US aircraft carriers like the USS Abraham Lincoln and the entire carrier battle group were moved into this region. All the American military bases from Saudi Arabia to UAE to Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, they were all activated and additional troops were brought in. According to reports, at least 45 to 50,000 American troops are present across this region surrounding Iran. US has built at least 17 plus military bases and facilities that completely surrounds Iran from all the sides. So this obviously creates that mindset of insecurity for any country, right? The constant militarization over here and the axis between US, Israel, and the Gulf Sunni powers is something which has been an existential threat for Iran. And that leads Iran to get more aggressive. So this has been a tit for tat, an eye for an eye sort of a conflict right from 1940s. And as I said, there are no saints in this, right? Each country is equally responsible for the entire chaos that they have perpetuated. So the US even started placing advanced fighter jets. It started a big mobilization of the F-35s, F-22 Raptors, even the F-16s and 18s. It started positioning large number of tanker fleets, mainly for refueling, which means they're looking at sustained aerial operations. And for that, you need mid-air, air-to-air refueling. So multiple tankers were brought into the region, along with advanced air defense systems. US already plays a big role in air defense in the region through the Patriot battery system and the THAAD air defense system, which it has provided to several countries across the Persian Gulf. Right? So US further strengthened its air defense networks, brought in advanced electronic warfare equipment as well to try and jam Iranian networks. And we also saw the deployment of the world's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford. So this essentially was a preparation to not just intimidate Iran and force Iran to agree to certain terms, but also to create an option, a military option, that if the talks fail, if Iran doesn't budge to the terms of the United States, use this opportunity to strike Iran and possibly topple the regime itself. Now, at the Geneva talks, what happened? Could this war have been prevented? As experts say, war occurs only when diplomacy fails, right? So, what were the diplomatic efforts? Were they genuine? Were they genuinely focused on peace? Were they genuinely focused on addressing the tensions and the nuclear program issue of Iran? See, US had three main demands in the talks that were going on at Geneva. One demand was that Iran stops all nuclear enrichment, a complete halt, and will completely hand over all the stockpile it has built. Condition number two, Iran will basically stop its missile program and disarm the huge missile pileup it has built. Iran has a formidable arsenal of medium range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones and loitering munition, which can be used with deadly effect, as you might have seen since yesterday. I'm sure you must have seen all the visuals on social media, right? So the American condition was Iran should completely disarm its missile program. And the third condition, Iran should stop the funding of all the proxies, be it Hamas, Hezbollah, Kateb Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Their sponsorship should completely stop. These were the three conditions that were placed. Now, according to credible sources, Iran had agreed to the first condition. Because, see, the whole issue was about the nuclear program, right? Oman's foreign minister just the other day, on 27th of February, one day before the war started, he publicly gave a press statement saying we are very close to a historic deal, that Iran has agreed to stop all enrichment and even hand over the stockpile. Iranian officials were also publicly stating that they are agreeing to the end of their nuclear program. But what was unacceptable for Iran was the condition on stopping the sponsorship of the proxies and disarming its missile program. Iran sees this as essential to protect itself against the entire axis that Israel and Sunni powers and US have built against it. So when Iran's existence was being threatened, Iran backed out and Iran said, we'll not agree to the deal. Oman's foreign minister went on record to say that Iran had agreed to stop the enrichment and hand over the stockpile. And within a day, US and Israel have launched the strikes. Trump even started making baseless claims and allegations that Iran is building intercontinental ballistic missiles which can hit United States. This is completely false. Even US intelligence officials disagree secretly, covertly, right? On anonymous accounts, even US authorities have disagreed with this assessment that Iran is building ICBMs. Iran has no such known capabilities as of now. So these were baseless claims, very similar to what we saw in 2003 when then US President George Bush falsified intelligence to invade Iraq, because their goal was to change the regime and topple Saddam Hussein from power. They alleged that Iraq was developing WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. Even United Kingdom, under then Prime Minister Tony Blair, was part of this entire conspiracy. Falsified intelligence was used to justify this war to the American people and the British people. Eventually, they never found even one WMD, but their end goal, which was to topple Saddam Hussein, was achieved. But as you know, they left behind Iraq in complete tatters. They left behind a power vacuum. The Baathist party, which had given some stability to Iraq, had fallen, and a sectarian conflict broke out between Shias and Sunnis. It is this very conflict that created a fertile ground for more radicalism and extremism and the rise of Islamic State. So, as you can see, each country has its own self-interest. Iran has its own notorious agenda. Israel has its own selfish interests. United States has its own interests. So as a result, today we are in this state where a very serious, prolonged conflict can continue. Because just because the Ayatollah has been killed and top leaders have been killed doesn't mean the war is likely to end or the regime will be toppled overnight. This might extend for some more time. US, Israel definitely have the firepower and the capability to completely dismantle the Iranian regime. But it might take few days or few weeks or maybe even few months. And also don't take Iran lightly. Iran is a formidable power, right? Despite all the setbacks, it still packs a punch and can cause significant damage, as has been seen. Since yesterday, Iran has been able to cause significant damage to US military bases and attack important locations, including civilian targets across the region. So now Donald Trump, who has announced that the people of Iran have a once in a lifetime opportunity to capture power and topple the regime. This again raises very troubling questions. See, yes, the people of Iran need liberation from the radical Shia regime. They definitely need the liberation. They are celebrating it as well, right? But this is not for an external power to determine. It's not for outside powers like US and Israel to dictate. That's where the legality of all this action comes into question. What does this mean for international law? What does this mean for rules-based order and essentially the structures that were built in the post-World War era? See, none of these actions are legally justifiable. Under the UN Charter, the use of military force is strictly prohibited under Article 2, Clause 4. Even the threat of force, even threatening the political stability of another sovereign state, is prohibited. The only exception is under Article 15, where a country can act in self-defense. But to invoke self-defense doctrine, first there should be an armed attack by the other country. Let's say country A has attacked country B, right? And then country B can invoke the right to self-defense because it has come under an armed attack. But in the case of the war that broke out yesterday, the aggressors are clearly Israel and US. What's ironic is that the IDF, they have been posting on social media that they are acting in self-defense. Now, how can you explain the aggressor claiming the right to self-defense? Right? Iran is now acting in retaliation if you purely go by the established legal standards. So US and Israel are claiming this as a preemptive strike on Iran, and thus they are trying to link it with the doctrine of self-defense. But the very concept of preemptive strikes is in a legal gray area. It's not clearly defined under international law. But again, these big powers today don't care anymore about the international rules and the rules-based system. But this has always been the case, even in 1960s and 70s during the Cold War. The big powers would do what they want, right? That has been the biggest weakness of the international system as well. It shows the ineffectiveness of United Nations as well. Now, the point is, what does this all mean for India and the region? And how would Iran try to take forward this conflict? Now, as we discussed, the regime is facing its biggest ever crisis. The leadership is largely decapitated. Imagine the Ayatollah himself has been killed. The defense minister has been killed. Top generals have been eliminated. But however, Iran had put in place a succession plan and a clear chain of command. You still have a lot of loyal followers of the regime. You still have the Shia radicals who remain loyalists to the regime, who would not allow the regime to fall so easily. So, if at all the people of Iran rise up and rebel, then definitely there is a high likelihood of Iran completely collapsing. Because Iran right now can't deal with external and internal crisis. It doesn't have such capabilities. If the people of Iran were to grasp this opportunity, as Trump has been urging them to do, then probably it will accelerate the fall of the Iranian regime itself. But otherwise, the regime is it will most likely reorganize itself very soon. There would be new leaders and they might try to take forward the conflict and the war might even extend and drag. But there are statements coming from Donald Trump that they already have a succession plan in mind, that there are few favorable leaders in the regime who are acceptable to US, right? But if you look at Israel's intention and statements, it is more keen on bringing back the monarchy. The son of the Shah, the former Shah, Reza Pahlavi, who is in the United States, has been very active of late, making public statements as well. And Israel is quite keen to support the revival of monarchy. And this again goes in the interest of US and Israel. But this would be a huge setback for the Iranian people. Though the Shah's regime was much more favorable, Iran's sovereignty, its autonomy was completely compromised as the Shah's regime was just a puppet of US and the West. That's the last thing Iranian people want, and that will not bring any kind of stability into the region. So now, if let's say the war were to continue, the regime were to survive somehow for a few more months, you will definitely see a much bigger escalation with very disastrous consequences for the region. As I said, Iran does pack a punch despite all the setbacks. It has a formidable arsenal of medium range cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones and loitering munition, which can reach almost every major target. All American military bases are under reach. Israel and all its key targets will be under reach. Of course, they all have formidable air defense. Most of the projectiles are intercepted. But Iran can easily overwhelm the air defenses by swarming the airspace. And this can lead to long-term closure of the airspace. Look at the kind of economic chaos and disruption it has caused, particularly to civil aviation. Critical airports like Dubai has been shut. The Kuwait airport has been shut. So the entire airspace here has been cleared and it's declared as a no-go zone for civilian aircraft. And this can wreak complete havoc and chaos across the world. It has disrupted travel plans. It can affect civilians and the business interests as well. And Iran is now trying to leverage its trump card, which is to block the Hormuz Strait. Iran has already announced that it will not let even one vessel pass through the Hormuz Strait. So, any continued blockade of this choke point will have a crippling effect on global oil prices and energy supplies, especially to countries like India, right? So, that is something which really concerns the global community. But, however, US can easily crush the blockade. US has sufficient naval deployments and firepower in the region to wipe out the Iranian naval presence to clear the blockade. So this could lead to very intense fighting, at least for a few hours to days, at the Hormuz Strait, which could further escalate the tensions and further the casualties on all the sides. Now, what would the big powers do? The big powers, that is Russia, China, which consider Iran as their critical ally. Russia, China have already lost Syria and Venezuela. So Russia, China, maybe they'll not directly intervene because the cost is too high. Then the stakes would go nuclear. So Russia, China, they are unlikely to intervene in a direct confrontation, but definitely there would be some sort of support. China particularly is looking at supply of arms. There are reports that China is looking to supply the aircraft carrier killer missile, which could pose a direct threat to the American aircraft carriers and the naval vessels that are in the region. If China were to arm Iran with such capability, and if Iran were to even sink one naval vessel, then you're looking at a complete disaster scenario, unimaginable scenario of a huge escalation in the conflict that's going on. Russia is largely preoccupied in Ukraine. Russia's support would be largely covert and diplomatic, and maybe to some extent financial. But again, Russia itself is deprived of resources. It was even relying on Iranian drones for the Ukrainian war. So China is the one which could probably try and back the regime. But again, since the Ayatollah himself has been taken out, the top leadership has been decapitated, probably China could also be, it could see that its hands are largely tied, and we might see the full collapse of the Iranian regime itself. So, what does this all mean for India eventually? See, from India's perspective, any escalation here severely compromises our interests. First of all, the region is critical for our energy supplies. That is our number one concern. Nearly 65% of our crude oil imports comes from the Persian Gulf. It passes through the Hormuz Strait. Right? Through Hormuz Strait, 20% of the global oil traffic passes through the choke point. And India's entire shipments coming from Persian Gulf is passing through Hormuz Strait, which is roughly 65% of our oil imports. So this would be our number one concern: the rise in oil prices, the further destabilization of the global markets. That is something which could significantly hurt India. Then we have a massive diaspora community, 10 million strong diaspora across all the countries. We still have few Indians, particularly students, stuck in Iran. We have up to 37,000 Indian workers in Israel. We have 4 million Indians in UAE, 3.5 million Indians in Saudi Arabia, lakhs of Indians in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, even in Jordan, right? So even thinking of an evacuation is quite unrealistic given the numbers. Though India has pulled off large evacuations of thousands of people, even up to 2 lakh people we have evacuated during the Gulf War between Iraq and Kuwait. India evacuated close to 1.9 lakh people, which was one of the world's largest airlift. But evacuating 10 million people, or even a small portion of that 10 million, is going to be a huge nightmare and a challenge. So right now, the Indian government is on its toes. The required advisories have been issued. The Indian missions in all the countries are very active, in touch with the Indian community. And especially states like Kerala are extremely concerned. Because out of the 10 million Indian diaspora, 3 million of them are from the state of Kerala. So this is something that India would be very focused upon in the coming days. We would closely monitor the developments, and we would plan evacuations if required, at least some region specific evacuations if Indians' safety and their life comes at direct risk. Now, coming to our strategic and diplomatic interests. See, India had invested heavily in Iran, and we shared fantastic relations with the Iranian regime. Iran has been a very close strategic partner to counter Pakistan, to counter terrorism. and mainly to access Afghanistan and Central Asia. India had invested millions of dollars at the strategic Chabahar port to create this alternate trade route to link with Afghanistan and Central Asia. Now, because of American sanctions and American pressure, India has been forced to take a step back. Though we had got an initial exemption that lasted till 2025, now the Trump administration has removed this exemption, and right now, any trade with Iran will attract secondary sanctions on India. Plus, India has completely cut the budgetary allocation in this year's union budget. Zero allocation has been made for Chabahar port. Though an Indian company continues to operate the Shahid Beheshti terminal, the viability of using the port would be under question as long as the conflict and the tensions continue. So, this is something which could affect our long term strategic plans to counter Pakistan and to establish connectivity to Afghanistan and Central Asia. And in that regard, India will face a big challenge balancing the ties between the different powers in the region. Given the recent visit of PM Modi to Israel just before the conflict, it probably sends a signal that India is slightly more aligned with Israel and US. And this could send out a wrong message for the Arab states, for Iran and the others. This has been a very delicate balance we had stuck from a very long time. And right now, we are facing one of the biggest challenges for Indian diplomacy. So, India's response as of now has been pretty standard. India has called on all the parties to tone down and end the conflict and engage in talks and negotiations. We have reiterated the importance of respecting a country's sovereignty. This is a message for US, for Israel, for Iran as well, because Iran has been violating the sovereignty of all the other Arab states in the region. So India has called upon every country to stop the war immediately, respect the sovereignty of each other, and talk and engage in diplomacy to find a solution. So there's very little that India can do as far as de-escalating the conflict is concerned. But however, whatever happens will have direct implications for India. Let's say the regime falls completely, there is some stabilization, maybe that will create new opportunities for us to engage with Israel, with UAE, and all the key powers. Maybe a new Iranian regime, which is more favorable towards the West, could probably bring back some stability in the long run. But again, that's a big if. That is dependent on the regime collapsing and some sort of political stability coming back. But given the history of American intervention and the kind of chaos they have left behind, it's highly unlikely to occur. So, most likely the outcome would be eventual fall of the regime in some time and continued persistent chaos, which would only breed more radicalism, drive more extremism as well, which would leave behind a trail of destruction across the region. So it's a very big topic. I know we have taken a lot of time, but given the importance of the development, I think it was worth discussing this in complete detail. So though we had done a separate video on this, I'm sure many students would not have watched it, right? So that's why we have completely discussed this again with greater insights. So please take up this mains question for your answer writing practice. Now let's quickly go through the remaining articles in the paper. On page 6, there's a very interesting article here that talks about the inverse law of AI. What is this inverse law of AI? Now, before I talk about the inverse law of AI, I have to introduce you to one of the AI summits. I'm not talking about the AI summit that India hosted recently. There is a different AI summit that mainly focuses on the military applications of AI. It's called RE-AIM, Responsible Artificial Intelligence in the Military Domain. The RE-AIM summit, which started in 2023, three such summits have taken place. This runs parallelly to your AI summit, which was recently hosted by India as well. While the AI summit, the AI safety summit, AI action summit, AI impact summit, they mainly focus on the governance and regulatory framework for artificial intelligence in general. The RE-AIM summit specifically focuses on the military applications and how to create ethical AI and regulate the militarization of artificial intelligence. The first RE-AIM summit, it took place in The Hague, Netherlands, where countries agreed to some framework, a non-binding framework, to focus on autonomous weapons and a call to action to ensure that there is some caution exercised and some ethical debates before advanced AI platforms are developed for military usage. The second REAIM summit was held in 2024 in Seoul, South Korea, where a blueprint was brought out. And the third REAIM summit was held recently in Spain, focusing on a set of principles that could govern the use of AI in military applications. Now, the writer says that when you look at the REAIM summit and the conversations, and also when you look at the AI summit, the first AI summit, AI safety summit in Bletchley Park in UK, or the Seoul AI summit in 2024, or the AI action summit of last year in Paris, and the AI impact summit in India. In the initial stages, the debate was more on safety, managing the risks, developing ethical AI. This was the focus of the global community back in 2022, when AI was still in its nascent stage. But in the last 3-4 years, AI has made rapid exponential advances. And today, the focus is basically on rapid development and deployment of AI without any thought being given for the misuse and the consequences of weaponization of AI. Even if you look at AI Impact Summit, the entire focus was on driving more investments, focusing on AI infrastructure. But there was hardly any worthwhile debate on safety of AI, on preventing harmful AI applications from coming up. The ethical aspect, right, the philosophical aspect of AI was hardly discussed. The same has been seen in the REAIM summit as well. Now, this is something that concerns the writer. The writer who participated in the REAIM summit, he talks about this index called Responsibility Index, right? It's its own creation. He says that when it comes to AI, to what extent countries are willing to take responsibility for the safety risks attached with weaponization of AI. And he says that when it comes to responsibility, there is an inverse law that applies. What is this inverse law? According to this inverse law, when more capital is invested in artificial intelligence, the focus on safety and responsibility declines. The writer says that this is an inverse relationship. That's why the inverse law of AI. So essentially, according to the writer, previously there were diplomats, military strategists and experts, ethicists, who are ethical thinkers who are driving these summits in 2023. The REAIM summit and as well as the AI summit, primarily it was driven by the narrative of the philosophy of AI. How could this affect society or democratic societies and nations? How it could impact human health or human survival, right? What could be the impact on livelihood? These were the initial set of debates that were taking place when experts with the right talent were driving these discussions. But today, according to the writer, these summits in 2025-26, it's being driven just by the capitalists, by those who care only about profits, those who are in a rush to develop the most sophisticated AI and they want to deploy it without giving a second thought about the safety risk and the ethical concerns. So, according to this inverse law of AI, when there is more and more capital being pumped into the domain, the focus on safety responsibility equally declines. So it's an inversely proportional relationship, and that is the inverse law of AI. See, initially, when the groundbreaking platforms were being developed, it was entirely in the hands of few genius engineers and few companies in the world, right, which could bring out these technologies. So at least then there was some better control with regard to the ethical aspect of AI and the safety risk aspect of AI. But today, it's no longer about a single genius or a single team which can build. Today, AI can create its own better version, right? And today, it's all about having access to better infrastructure and resources. If you have enough money, enough capital, if you're able to procure enough GPUs, build up data centers, arrange for the power supply and cooling solutions, today anybody can pursue advances in AI. It's not just restricted to few countries or in the hands of few elite talented individuals, right? And there is a sovereign element which has been clearly added, the sovereignty of data, sovereignty of control over AI infrastructure. And this is pushing the world towards a race, a new type of a race to use AI in militarization, in arms and weapons, in autonomous targeting systems for mass surveillance. And there's barely any concern being expressed or debates being carried out on this issue. Remember what Sam Altman said at the AI Impact Summit in Delhi when a question was asked to him about the huge power consumption and environmental footprint of AI data centers. His answer would shock you. He said, it would take the same amount of energy and money to train a human being. So basically, you're equating the cost. Essentially, you're comparing human evolution and the human value, right, to machines and systems. And tomorrow, if this is the future, capital would go towards creating these machines, which are going to eventually replace humans in most activities, processes, and decision making elements. And that is the real concern which the writer is flagging here. And he says that there is an inverse law which works in AI. As more venture capitalists and big tech firms pump more and more money and investments, as governments get behind these companies and pump more money, the capital rises in AI, but safety responsibility takes a downfall. So, this inverse connection between capital and responsibility is the inverse law of AI. So, please take up this practice question on this important topic and try to express your views on the ethical regulation that's needed for AI, especially for weaponization of artificial intelligence. Next, there's a article on page 11 that helps us understand the MOU that was recently signed between India and Brazil on rare earths. We've already covered the topic briefly. We have recently had a discussion on what India is doing to step up its domestic production and external procurement of critical strategic minerals. We even discussed about the visit of Brazilian leader Lula da Silva, and we mentioned the critical minerals agreement between India and Brazil. So here we will just understand the relevance and importance of this particular agreement. See, Brazil has a lot to offer for India. Brazil is blessed with several critical strategic minerals. It is said that it has significant deposits of bauxite, then rare earth oxides, even some deposits of lithium, manganese. So, this is something which is very, very useful in today's global supply chains. And India has a very formidable plan today, focusing on domestic production, domestic exploration under the National Critical Mineral Mission. India has brought out a list of 30 critical minerals. It has also relaxed the Mines and Mineral Development Regulatory Amendment Act to make it easier for government to auction these mineral blocks, which are listed as critical strategic minerals. India has set up a dedicated public sector entity, Khanij Bidesh India Limited, or KABIL, to scout for mines across the world. It has already secured mining access in Argentina, Chile, in the lithium triangle, in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Then India is focusing on recycling as well. So India is having this three pronged approach. One is on domestic exploration and production to try and become more self-reliant. Second is on external procurement of mines and playing a role in external supply chains with trusted partners. And third is on recycling. So India has been doing this. And in the budget, India has even announced a cut on custom duty and taxes for machines and goods imported for mining and processing of critical minerals in the country. So all the right policies are being brought out and the support is being provided. But however, partnership with countries like Brazil can be very significant because according to experts, only 30% of Brazil's resources have now been explored. If further exploration is carried out, definitely Brazil has much more potential. That is where India could play a big role, and both countries can stand to benefit through this collaboration on rare earths and critical minerals. This MOU is not binding, of course, but it brings two emerging economies together with a common interest. If Brazil can become a reliable supplier of rare earths and key raw materials and critical minerals, it could create more options for India, diversifying our procurement sources, reducing our dependency on supply chains controlled by few countries like China. Right? It increases India's bargaining power and it provides guaranteed supplies for Indian industries, from automobiles to semiconductors to electronics, which can create new opportunities in the Indian market. When there is a guarantee that supplies are diversified and geopolitical shocks can't impact them, or one country can't block the supply of key raw materials, it gives a sense of security for the entire industry, gives more strategic and economic options for India, and increases the bargaining power of India. It will secure that self reliance for India. Similarly, Brazil will also stand to gain because see, Brazil right now is struggling to focus on exploration on its own. It has explored only 30% of its available resources, and still there's plenty of scope to scout for lithium, rare earth oxides, and even other key raw materials. So India could probably become an investor in some of these projects, right? Indian companies could make long-term investments in these mining projects, and this MOU covers the entire cycle of critical minerals, right from exploration to mining to processing to refinement. In all the steps, India could become a partner for Brazil, where Indian companies could invest and even sign long term supply contracts. This gives more stability for Brazil as well to make these risky investments. Because investing in mining and exploration and processing and refining of critical minerals is very, very expensive. So, if Indian firms can create a long term demand, there would be greater push in Brazil to invest in these projects, and Indian capital could be pushed into Brazil, creating a very trusted partnership across the entire life cycle of critical and strategic minerals. See, on one side, we are joining big alliances like Pax Silica Initiative, which is a US led initiative, right, focused on securing essential minerals, that is, critical minerals and silicon and graphite, which is crucial for semiconductor and electronics industry. So, while these big alliances are important, it's equally important to focus on bilateral arrangements with trusted countries like Brazil so that we can create more independence, protect our autonomy, and ensure that we diversify our supply chains. So, this increases India's own bargaining power and it also strengthens Brazil's negotiating position. So, it can be a win win deal, a mutually beneficial deal for both sides. So, that is where the relevance of this MOU on rare earths lies. Coming to the next article, on page 9, there's a detailed column on disinvestment in India. It's a very interesting and important article. See, Government of India has a dedicated department called DPIM, the Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, which was created just to focus on disinvestment. Disinvestment is essentially the reduction of the government stakes in government held entities like public sector units, PSUs, central public sector undertakings or establishments. Reducing the majority stake of the government, pulling the government out of these businesses, and allowing for the private sector to take over. See, in the globalized world since 1990s, there is a concept in public administration called New Public Management or NPM. Under NPM, the philosophy is that government has no business in being in business. Right? Government should be an enabler, should be a catalyst to the private sector. And it should basically allow market forces to take over. Government should not be involved in running airlines, managing hotels, or producing oil or soaps or watches. That's not the job of the government. The government is supposed to create the right policies, regulatory framework, right, give the right incentives and support, and act as an enabler and catalyst for the private sector. Because governments inherently tend to be inefficient because of the huge employee headcount and the risk aversion. Right, within government, it's very hard to take bold, courageous decisions that are sometimes required. As a result, in public sector entities, decision making slows down. There would be red tapeism, inefficiency, which gets built up. So most of these entities end up becoming loss making units. So, given this experience of India throughout the socialist era, the focus on disinvestment started with our LPG reforms, with liberalization, privatization, and globalization. But from 1990s till, let's say, 2010s, India didn't really carry out much of disinvestment. Apart from some disinvestment which happened under the Vajpayee administration, nothing much really happened with regard to disinvestment. Under the Modi government, disinvestment policy was very proactively revived, and the government even rolled out the disinvestment policy in 2020. Under the disinvestment policy, the goal was to divest the stakes of the government and sell off the shareholding, the stakeholding in these public sector companies, and basically to get rid of the loss making entities which were becoming a burden on the government. So this was the thinking, this was the policy mindset of India just a few years ago, that public sector companies are largely redundant, irrelevant, and as much as possible, government will divest the stakes, but it will only keep and hold on to some of the profitable companies and strategic sectors. So, accordingly, a national monetization pipeline was also set up. So, under the Modi government, in the initial few years, particularly from 2020 to 2023, some amount of disinvestment was done, and a decent amount of revenue was also generated. Around 35,000 crores was generated at its peak. You can see that in the graph here, around 35,000 crores generated here. Even under the UPA government, especially during 2008-10 period, right? And as well as in the 2015-2016 period, some significant amount of disinvestment had taken place. These were some three phases where some decent amount of disinvestment was done. But now the government has had a realization that maybe disinvesting the shareholding is not the right approach. Maybe government should not be involved in running businesses, but these are eventual assets, long-term assets, which can actually bring more revenue, more capital receipts to the government. So today the approach of the government has started changing. The government has now started reducing the priority for disinvestment. You can see a big drop that happens in disinvestment receipts in the last couple of years. Today, disinvestment receipts have fallen to around 10 to 15,000 crores. And very soon it's likely to become little insignificant as well. But instead, look at how the government is generating sustained revenue through dividends and by leasing public sector capabilities to the private sector. The government has been generating massive revenue to the tune of 60,000 to 75,000 crores in the last couple of financial years. So the government's focus is now moving towards earning more from the public sector units, treating them as assets, not just as burden and loss making units. And the government is reducing the priority for disinvestment. In fact, even in the budget, previously there used to be a separate heading for disinvestment proceeds under capital receipts. Now, this separate heading has been removed entirely. It has been merged with miscellaneous capital receipts. That shows the low priority the government is now giving for disinvestments. Instead, it's looking to earn more dividend and assets and basically monetize these assets in the right way. So, a new national monetization policy has been introduced, the National Monetization Policy 2.0. And the government has set a very ambitious goal to start generating revenue worth at least 16 lakh crores in the coming years. Over the next 5-year period, the government has set this goal for itself to create additional revenue for the government to the tune of 16 lakh crores, not through reduction of government stake, but by earning more dividends, by allowing the companies to operate more freely, generate more profits, make them profitable, turn them around, and ensure that these assets are retained in the government. Government is even working out the leasing arrangements where public sector capabilities are being leased out to private sector, which again generates revenue to the government. Today, public sector entities have been given more flexibility, more autonomy for administrative decisions, for financial decisions as well. And this is a fundamental shift in the manner in which India looks towards public sector undertakings. Is that clear? Government still believes that there's no business for government in business. Government should not be running businesses. But whatever entities are already there, you should not treat them as liabilities. Instead, you should turn them around, treat them as assets, generate more revenue. And that is the current trend that you're witnessing. Coming to the next topic, the central government has put a temporary stop on rice fortification scheme, which has attracted a lot of controversy. See, the government of India, which is focused on dealing with micronutrient deficiency, uses various fortification programs, like how iodine is primarily introduced through common salt, through table salt, right? Similarly, rice was fortified with iron and other micronutrients, mainly to tackle anemia. But however, scientific studies have proven that this may not really have the desired impact. It may even have an adverse effect. That's why many activists had approached Supreme Court of India, filed petitions against the government to stop this unscientific scheme. So the government had commissioned a study with IIT Kharagpur, and the study has clearly established that when rice is fortified with iron and other micronutrients, because of all the processing and additional handling, it reduces the shelf life of the rice. It makes it more vulnerable to quickly rot, and thus it could create a lot of wastage, and it also doesn't bring the required nutritional benefits. And also the assumption that anemia is only because of iron deficiency is a very narrow assumption, right? Anemia could be caused by a few other related factors as well. And studies have also shown that fortification of any staple food with iron may not directly translate into increased iron absorption, which could help tackle the anemia crisis in our country. So, based on this scientific evidence and the demand by the civil society and the activists, the government has finally accepted that rice fortification may not be a scientific approach, and it has put a temporary stop under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana and other welfare schemes and food security schemes through which fortified rice was being provided. But however, this will not affect any existing food entitlements, right? The beneficiaries, whatever entitlement they had, those entitlements will continue. It will not disrupt the PDS, the public distribution system. But only the fortified rice would be stopped and regular rice would be provided. So the government has said it's a temporary halt to carry out further studies and figure out the best way to tackle anemia and whether fortification of rice would have any benefit or not. Now, coming to the prelims section, let's take a quick look at the small articles in the paper. On page number 8, there's an article focusing on the cheetah reintroduction program of India. See, India launched the cheetah reintroduction program as a pet project of Prime Minister Modi. In 2022, Namibia became the first African country to supply India with cheetahs. Around 8 cheetahs were supplied by Namibia, which were introduced in the Kuno National Park in Madhya Pradesh. Then South Africa became the second African nation which supplied around a dozen cheetahs, which were also primarily introduced in the Kuno National Park. But some of them passed away, but many of them managed to adapt and thrive, and several cubs have been born in India. So today, the total population has gone up to 48. Now, Botswana has become the third African country to supply cheetahs to India for the reintroduction program. Botswana has supplied a set of new cheetahs, which have been introduced into the Kuno National Park. Some of them have been accommodated at the Gandhi Sagar Wildlife Sanctuary in Madhya Pradesh as well. So today the population has jumped to a healthy 48, with 20 of them being procured from these African countries and 28 of them born in India. These are the younger cubs that are recently born. Though several of them passed away, it still points towards the success of the reintroduction program. So remember the three countries that have contributed to the reintroduction program. First Namibia, then South Africa, and recently Botswana. And the places where they have been reintroduced: Kuno National Park and Gandhi Sagar Wildlife Sanctuary in Madhya Pradesh. Next, art and culture topic. The Tribal Affairs Ministry is hosting several festivals to highlight and promote the art and culture of tribal communities in India, and to create more opportunities for tribal products and boost the economy for the tribal artwork and handicrafts. So please note down the names of the initiatives and the purpose. The Tribal Affairs Ministry will be hosting the Living Roots Music Festival in New Delhi. The Living Roots Music Festival would basically celebrate the diverse music and art forms of various tribal groups in the country. It's a platform for them to showcase their talent. Then the Bharat Tribes Fest. Under the Bharat Tribes Fest, which is a rebranded version of the Adi Mahotsav Tribal Product Showcase, the government is creating a platform for tribal communities to showcase their products, their indigenous artwork and products, which can be commercialized and a separate market can be created for them. So the government is setting up a tribal business conclave to promote the spirit of entrepreneurship within the tribal community. There will be a parallel tribal art fest as well, just to display the artwork and create a separate market for this, so that it can drive more revenue, create more livelihood opportunities, and push the tribal communities to focus on their self run businesses. So that's a topic under art and culture and society. Next, the United Nations, the UN Security Council, has lifted the sanctions on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the same group which I was mentioning in the context of Syria. The HTS was a Al Qaeda affiliated terror group which was sanctioned by the 1267 Sanctions Committee of the UN Security Council. Now, please read more about the composition of the 1267 Sanctions Committee, and please mention the key points in the comment section. That's one small exercise for you. What does the 1267 Sanctions Committee deal with? It basically deals with designation of global terror groups and individual terrorists. And once they're designated, three types of sanctions will apply on them. It will result in economic sanctions, where all the financial assets are frozen. It will result in restriction on their right to movement, meaning the countries are obligated to detect the presence of these terrorists and arrest them, detain them, and also restrict and limit the availability of arms and weapons to these designated terrorists. These three sanctions are supposed to be applied by all the UN member states when they are designated by the 1267 Sanctions Committee. Now, I want you to find out the composition of this committee. Like, who are the members, which countries are part of it, and what's the decision-making process. That's one exercise for you. Now, these sanctions on HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was an Al-Qaeda linked outfit, it has been completely lifted by the UNSC. Its leader, al-Gulani, who now goes by a different name, he goes by the name Ahmed al-Sharaa, he has become the president of Syria after HTS successfully toppled the Assad regime in 2024. So until then, he was seen as a global terrorist. The outfit itself was sanctioned by the UNSC. But now the HTS is being embraced by the UN and the global community. Especially United States has completely recognized the new regime under Ahmed al-Sharaa. Trump even met with Ahmed al-Sharaa, a former Al-Qaeda terrorist, and now he has been recognized as the legitimate leader of Syria, and UNSC has even lifted all the sanctions on Ahmed al-Sharaa and as well as the terror group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Coming to the last topic, again related to art and culture, there is a sari which is mentioned, the Sungudi sari, which is produced in Tamil Nadu, particularly in the Madurai belt. It's a local cotton sari made through traditional handloom techniques, but it has a very interesting historic origin. The artwork, right, it actually goes back to the Saurashtra region, that is today's Gujarat region primarily. That's where the particular handicraft originated. Back in 17th century, the artisans, they moved from Saurashtra towards the southern part of India, towards the Madurai region, and they set up their handlooms over here to produce the famous Sungudi saris. So these traditional cotton saris are very, very popular. It's a skill which is passed down through generations, and it's even recognized with the GI tag. In 2005, it was provided the GI tag to protect its unique identity and create a unique market to create more opportunities for the local weavers and the handloom mills. So with this, we bring today's elaborate analysis to an end. If you like the session, do press the like button, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.